When I was invited to speak here today in Thessaloniki about the courage to create, I thought immediately of all the writers in the past decades and even centuries who've actually been persecuted for their writing. Those writers really needed courage. Like most British writers, I belong to an organisation called PEN International, and PEN International campaigns very vigorously for all the writers who are currently imprisoned or persecuted around the world. And every year it publishes a list of those people and runs campaigns for specific individuals, and with great success sometimes. The most recent list had approximately 1,000 names, so I kind of felt in some ways I had to mention those writers because they are the really courageous people who are prepared to go to prison for what they put down on paper. At the moment, there's a very high-profile Chinese writer called Liu Xiaobo, who is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he's currently still in prison in China. And perhaps a sort of more famous recent example, somebody who's not in prison but who was persecuted in Turkey, was Orhan Pamuk. And in Britain, he's a very highly thought of author. And his crime is probably, you all know, he was insulting Turkishness for writing about the Kurds and the Armenians. But in the 20th century, in Greece, there are many examples of writers who showed enormous courage. Again, I haven't read some of these because they haven't been translated, so forgive me for not having read extensively their works. Maybe somebody after this talk will come up and translate a few of their poems for me. Of course, there was Yanis Ritsos, who spent much of his life exiled on those islands of exile, and had his works burnt and was persecuted for many years. And then apparently a man called Titos Patrikios, I'm told he had to bury some of his poems to protect them from the authorities. In Britain, we have pretty much complete freedom of speech, and it's something that always needs protecting. It's not something we should take for granted. And I happened to notice on the PEN website that there are these local branches of PEN all around the world, and I couldn't find one that was actually based here in Greece. So that's maybe a challenge to the audience here, that there really should be one set up in this country to help writers in other countries. So for me, courage, I only really need it when the book reviews come out. You know, it's not a big factor in my own life. And of course, critics have complete freedom of speech, and that's the only time when I really feel terrified about being a writer, apart from standing on this red circle, which is, frankly, no one's yet mentioned it, I don't think. It does require a little bit of courage, maybe more than I've ever needed. But I write about courage. I write about other people's courage. It is the one single thing that really inspires me, is the courage of ordinary people. Spinalonga, this is a picture of an island that I think some of you will be familiar with from having watched the television series of Tonnessee. And when I first went there as a tourist, I knew absolutely nothing about the place. I knew nothing about leprosy, which was the reason people were sent to Spinalonga, apart from the fact there was a huge stigma surrounding it. And what I discovered when I even went on that first visit was that the people there, apparently, from what I could see, had lived relatively very normal lives. These were people who were, as you can see from this picture, living within they could see their families, maybe their relatives, living on the mainland opposite. And yet, many of them went there for decades, and they showed huge courage in surviving the life that they had there. the clues that sort of told me that these people, how courageous they'd been and really how sort of long-suffering they'd been, were little things actually within the infrastructure of the island itself. There were little tiny pieces of curtain fluttering still from the window frames, and patches of walls still painted in a sort of lovely bright blue, and pots of geraniums that had been there probably for a couple of decades. And there was a cafe neon and a church and shops and all these things that showed what normal lives that they lived. The stigma of leprosy is a strange one. It actually goes back to biblical days when people were told, there's a whole chapter in the Old Testament, people were told that leprosy was a punishment from God, either a sin that you had committed or even a sin perhaps that one of your ancestors had committed. So it was based on a complete fallacy, in effect. And of course, leprosy it tends to deform people. That's what happens in the end after many years of having the disease. And we fear what is different, and we fear what is ugly. In the television serial, we portrayed actually many different ways in which leprosy affects the body. Sometimes it's facial deformities with sort of the lesions on the skin, and other times the nerve endings, which are destroyed by the leprosy bacteria, lead to the loss of fingers, toes, arms, legs. And it's actually a bacterial disease, this, not obviously a curse from God. And the cure was actually found in the 1950s, having the bacteria having been identified about 50 years earlier. And at that time, the stigma should have gone. Everybody should have realized this isn't a curse from God. It is just a disease like any other disease, an illness like tuberculosis that any one of us could catch, whether we were a priest, a child, a king, a man in the street. At every levels of society, it's possible to contract this disease. And the people on Spinalonga showed great courage, because when they came away from that island, many of them bore the marks of that disease and were still treated and shunned by society. When the island, the Tonisi, was translated, I had the huge privilege of meeting a man called Manoli Fundulaikis, who was probably the most courageous person I've ever met. You'll see from the picture that Manoli suffered from leprosy himself, and he shows many of the kind of characteristic sort of deformities from the disease. And yet he was the wisest, funniest, kindest man I've ever met. He never complained about anything at all, and we became very good friends for the period of his life. He sadly died 2 years ago, almost to the day. But he was probably the man who inspired very much the television series. As you can see, he played as an extra, and that was an extraordinary moment in my own life of playing an extra myself, kind of being made up to have leprosy, but standing with Manoli, who really had suffered from the disease. And he demonstrated that leprosy changes the body, but very much not the mind or the personality. And he inspired everybody who worked on Tonisi. Most people spent hours every day up at his house having a raki that he made. I don't know if you can see, probably quite clearly actually, he had very sort of distended hands, very big hands, which is something that can happen when the leprosy bacteria attacks the nerve endings. But with these huge kind of giant hands of his, he used to make, somehow, I never actually saw him doing it, but this magnificent cherry raki that was his kind of speciality. So I sometimes think that half the actors and the crew were a little bit kind of inebriated, having gone up to see Manoli, but he was a truly courageous and inspirational man. After writing Tonisi, I sort of stumbled across the story of a civil war and wrote a novel set in Spain. And there, again, this was the courage of ordinary people in the street that inspired me to write that story. Probably everyone here knows about their own civil war, but the Spanish Civil War actually has a lot of similar sort of characteristics to it as the Greek Civil War. Except the Spanish Civil War was quite short and sharp, 3 years, during which ordinary people, teenagers, women, everyone who basically was anti-fascist, took up a weapon and fought against a trained army. And sadly, the Republic, i.e. the legally elected Republic, people who fought for that lost. And until 1975, so for nearly 40 years, people who'd fought against Franco, the army general who had conducted the coup, were persecuted, imprisoned, sent into exile. A lot of children ended up away from their parents all around the world to try and escape from the sort of evils of that fascist regime. But it was an inspirational story for me. Again, reading about these ordinary people and then writing about what they tried to achieve. And then more latterly, Thessaloniki. And my latest story is so much a story of the courage of the people of this city that my English readers think that I've made up a lot of the catastrophes that took place here. They say, well, you know, how much of this is real? Could there really have been a fire, an influx of a huge number of refugees and departure of a huge number of Muslims, occupation, civil war, the loss of a third of the population of 60,000 Jewish people here, and then many other things. And my book actually ends with the earthquake of 1978, and readers at home almost find this impossible to believe, that anyone could have actually survived, because some people did see each of those events and lived to tell the story. Once I discovered that there was this sequence of catastrophes that happened in Thessaloniki, I was sitting in a Kathimerini one day out there in the sunshine, and I saw an elderly couple. They were probably about 85, 90, and they were smaller than me, smaller than the average Greek, definitely smaller than the average Greek teenager, but very strong looking, and in a slightly strange way. And maybe they're sitting out here somewhere, those people, they don't know who they are, but I followed them home, and they lived in a polykatechia like this, and I watched them struggling home with their shopping, and they were tough and they were strong, and they became, in my imagination, my heroes. One of them, Katharina, is a refugee from Asia Minor, and the elderly man in my mad novelist imagination, Dimitris, is the man she eventually marries. And these people in my head lived through those extraordinary events of the 20th century that required, from an outsider's point of view, absolutely superhuman courage. And again, maybe this is an image everybody here has seen. It's a sort of iconic picture of Papa Ioannou that she took during the occupation, showing a starving child. And when I think of what the Greek people lived through during the war, again, it's unbelievable for British people. We think we suffered during the Second World War, but we weren't occupied. We always had food. We always had shoes. We lost a lot of people during that conflict, but we didn't live through the pain and the conflict and the suffering that the Greek people did. And what I do try to communicate to people in the UK, and I'm lucky at the moment to have this opportunity with this book that I've written to go around the country and do lots of talks about it. And I always end up really talking about the current situation and explaining how there is a link between these things that have happened in Greece up to the present day, that the current things that you're going through didn't just begin 10 years ago. And 90 years ago, 60 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, there have been these points in Greek history where I think you have to have a lot of courage. I'm very passionate about Greece, but I have this sort of, in some ways, great fortune that I can come and go. And I know here you have to stay and not fight exactly, but be strong for what's happening. And my message, if I have one at all, is that you need to continue to have that courage. You have a huge number of friends outside who are now beginning to see that your situation is part of a bigger situation. I didn't intend to talk about British politics at all, but probably not in your newspapers, because I know you're probably completely fixated on your own situation. But a week ago in England, we had local elections all around the country, and there was a huge movement away from the right to the left. We still have Cameron, because they weren't general elections, but it really rocked our country that there is this shift away from conservatism towards the left. And the same obviously happened in France, and there's a shift. And I think the whole of Europe needs courage to face what's going to happen in the next year or so. So, from me, I know in English, funnily enough, we use a French phrase, very odd. We have a strange relationship with the French, but occasionally we sort of break into French, like bon voyage, we'll say. You know, we never say have a good journey, we say bon voyage. And we say bon courage. We say, I think, to translate, it would be Kathimerini. And I think everyone here maybe needs courage in the next few months, more than I do. But Kathimerini for all my Greek friends here. Thank you.